Welcome back. In a moment, we'll be discussing living rivers, rivers that have been afforded the same rights as people. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. Palestinians have marked Nakba Day, or a day of catastrophe. In Ramallah, a siren was sounded to commemorate the day in 1948, the Middle East War, during which Palestinian homes were seized. In Israel, the day prior to Nakba is celebrated as the day that Israel declared its independence. Microsoft has described the global cyber attack that spread across the world on Friday as a wake-up call. The tech giant said governments were stockpiling vulnerabilities after more than 150 countries were hit by the ransomware. Microsoft said that the severity of the cyber attack was comparable to the U.S. military having Tomahawk missiles stolen. And 330 endangered tortoises have been seized by airport authorities in Malaysia. The reptiles, which as you can see were found alive, were smuggled in luggage on a flight from Madagascar and could have fetched over $250,000 on the black market. An Indian court has declared the sacred Ganges and Yamuna rivers living entities. Now that means that the rivers will have the same legal rights as a person, and polluting these rivers amounts to harming a human being. Both rivers are considered sacred in India and are considered goddesses by the majority Hindu population. Nevertheless, they become heavily polluted due to industrialization and rapid urbanization. Here's some background on the Ganges.
The Ganges, one of the world's great rivers, held sacred for centuries. Like the Yamuna, it's considered a goddess by the majority Hindu population in India. Millions worship here and depend on the river for washing and sustenance. But like the Yamuna, the Ganges has been polluted and degraded to a shocking level, a threat to human health and the delicate ecosystem. Two top state officials will now become the legal guardians of both and will represent their rights. Activists say the order is likely to fast-track efforts to clean the rivers, offering a glimmer of hope for a brighter future for one of the most beautiful rivers in the world.
To discuss that further, I'm joined by Savio Carvalho, who is the global head of campaigns for the international charity WaterAid. What a ruling. I mean, a lot of people are saying that's just the beginning, because you have not only India, but New Zealand, and a lot of other countries are looking at that and saying, what an immense stride forward in environmental protection.
It is. I think we would welcome this ruling because it actually puts in focus what's happening to the river, but not just the river, but the interdependence of the river with communities. You have millions of people who live on the banks of the Ganges who have very little access to sanitation. For example, in India, you have the statistics around 540 million people who still practice open defecation. So while the Ganges is put in focus, I think the importance is what happens to these communities who live on the banks of the river. How does the government of India actually reach out to these communities and provide water, hygiene management, and sanitation? For us, that's equally important in a sense.
Important, if I might interrupt, but that question's been there for decades and the government's failed. And essentially, isn't this the incident where you have a court saying, that's it, we give special status and legal status to these rivers because government's not fulfilling its promises?
It is indeed a wake-up call. It's a wake-up call for the government of India to pull up its socks and say, yes, let's get on to work. For example, the government of India has signed the Sustainable Development Goals. So the government of India needs to ensure that there's sufficient resources on the table. You can have toilets. The government of India has committed to have toilets for every household. That's fine, but then you also need to ensure that there's sufficient resources for maintenance and behavioral changes in the community itself, in households, as simple as changes around washing your hands after defecation. So it's not just the infrastructure, but also it is what happens in the communities and what happens in the households, where rights of individuals are protected and respected. So for example, women and girls, they need to have access and they need to have the privacy, and the government of India needs to ensure that they just not look at the Ganges, but look at what's happening in the surroundings.
I mean, more than any other river in the world, as you pointed out, there's human excrement directly put in it, garbage, and yet they consider it holy to bathe in it. And they don't seem, is the public demanding that it be cleaned up, or have they just come to terms with it?
I think the public has been for a very long time calling for the Ganges and other rivers to be protected and being clean. It's the same government who sort of gives licenses for mining and gives license for brick kilns on the banks of the Ganges. And this is the same government now who is tasked to sort of clean up the Ganges. So the government has to look at it by taking responsibility for its own action and ensuring that it creates no more harm and protects both the river and the ecology around it.
These things are great to talk about, but how would it work in application now? Does the river have a right in court?
Well, as of now, one is looking at the Ganges not just as an ecosystem, because there's no human being who will represent the Ganges per se. But I think the government of India needs to sort of look at the Ganges as an ecosystem. It has to look at the Ganges as a part of the community. And this is what the court has actually said, that people live on this river, they depend on this river.
Who represents the river? Because if the government does, they often have competing interests because, development versus environment, and often development wins out. So almost anybody could represent that river and take the government to court.
This is like the New Zealand case where the river has been given the status of a human being. I think it's the recognition now, including by people, but for a very long time, for ages, but also by the courts now, that you just can't separate the two. You can't segregate that this is a river and those are people. I think there is that ecosystem, and I think the government will have to work with that.
The New Zealand ruling, which you make reference to, is interesting because it says the river should be treated like a minor in court. They must be entitled to voice.
Yes, and I think that this is not just about the river. It's about the forest. It's about natural resources. It's about what's happening around where people live, because most of these people actually do not have the facilities that they require, and they depend, and there's a relationship with nature, and I think the government needs to really protect that.
What got lost in some of the news stories is that this same ruling said glaciers in the Himalayas, vital to India's water resources, have the same rights. So just not rivers, but the actual glaciers which are under attack from global warming and industry.
And that neatly leads us to climate change, that the government of India actually has to, and with all other governments across the world, needs to step up and do much more with a sense of urgency, because it is the poor and the marginalized who suffer the most, who have been impacted by climate change.
So let's say they have the legal teeth now to go ahead and say, okay, you're polluting that river. Can they really enforce it? Because so many people themselves pollute it. They can't start arresting people and fining people, can they?
This is important because you can't have a court verdict and still have impunity. Somebody will have to be held to account, and somebody will have to actually face the wrath of the court in case the government doesn't do its job. And I think it's high time.
And the government may face the wrath of the court.
Yes, and it's high time the government realizes that it's just not the river, but it's the communities and individuals, boys, girls, women who actually live on the banks of the river and need the facilities that they're entitled to as part of their human rights.
I was a young reporter in Canada when they started selling off vast tracts of forest in northern Canada to pulp mills in Japan. Nobody really spoke for the forest, and the government wouldn't take a position to defend them. Do you think, I mean, this is interesting, and that was called the lungs of North America. Could it be forests? Could it be lakes? Could it be mountains next?
Indeed, it should be in a sense, because for years together, especially in India, communities have been fighting to protect their natural resources. They've gone on hunger strikes, they've gone in protest, and I think in some places they have won, some places they have not won. And this is an ongoing struggle. The Ganga is just an example, but it happens in the length and breadth of India.
So, such an interesting topic. Thanks so much for talking to us today. We end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel that you should know. And today, we can bring you these images of a life-size art installation created by Greenpeace. The 15-meter-long, 3-meter-wide humpback whale is made of bamboo frames stuffed with tons of plastic and waste, and is on display on a beach near Nike in the Philippines. Greenpeace says the Philippines ranks third globally as the biggest contributor of plastics in the world's oceans, and is using the controversial art installation to try and promote a shift to greener materials. That's all for now. I'm Dana Lewis, and this was Inside.